Being born in the 1920s was terrible. Here's why. 1920s Europe is one of the most well-known and loved decades of all time. But being alive during this period would have been terrifying for anyone who wasn't a cat. But it also marked the beginning of a new era of peace and prosperity, at least for a few years. This was the Roaring Twenties. The stock market boomed, jazz music took over, and people were finally allowed to dance the Charleston without having to worry about being bombed. But those good times wouldn't last long, because right after the 1920s came the 1930s, and with them, the Great Depression, and then World War II. Global terrorism has been a problem for many years, but it really started to become a major issue in the late 20th century. The 1960s saw the first Earth Day and the creation of organizations like Greenpeace. You'd have to deal with all the medical issues that came with getting old. You'd have to deal with the threat of nuclear war throughout your entire life. There's a reason why it's one of the most well-known and loved decades of all time. Because if you actually lived during this period, you probably didn't make it out alive. From the start of the 20th century up until the present day, we've seen an incredible amount of change. Things that were once science fiction are now commonplace, and technology has advanced at an unprecedented rate. Some people might say that we're living in the best time to be alive, but if you were born in the 1920s, you would beg to differ. Thanks for watching. The first atomic bomb was dropped in 1945, and since then, we've come dangerously close to nuclear war several times. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other many times over. And there were several incidents in which almost certainly would have happened. For example, in 1983, a computer malfunction almost certainly launched a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. Thankfully, the system's backup computers caught the error and prevented a nuclear war. But this was just one of many close calls. Living in constant fear of nuclear war would have been incredibly stressful, and it would have cast a dark cloud over your entire life. And let's not forget that even if you managed to survive the initial nuclear blast, you'd still have to deal with the aftermath of nuclear winter. Nuclear winter is a hypothetical post-nuclear scenario in which smoke and dust particles block sunlight and cause global temperatures to plummet. This could lead to widespread crop failure and famine. Basically, if you managed to survive the initial blast, you'd probably die from the cold or starvation. We've come a long way in the field of medicine, but there's still no cure for most diseases that affect the elderly, such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and various types of cancer. This means that as you get older, you're likely to suffer from at least one of these diseases. And if you were born in the 1920s, you'd probably be old enough to see them become more common. For example, in the early 1900s, the life expectancy in the United States was only 47 years old. That means that if you were born in the 1920s, you wouldn't live past the 1960s. And back then, there were very few treatments available for most diseases. This meant that you'd likely die a horrible and slow death from whatever disease you had. But it was until the 1970s and 80s that environmental issues really started to become a major concern. In the 1970s, the world saw the first major oil crisis, which led to a quadrupling of oil prices. This had a major impact on the global economy and helped to cause a recession. In the 1980s, concerns about the environment only grew. The ozone hole was discovered in 1985, and the world began to realize the damage that humans were doing to the planet. This led to a lot of changes, such as the banning of certain chemicals and the development of new technologies that were more environmentally friendly. But it was a difficult time for many people because they had to change their way of life in order to protect the environment. Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS carried out attacks that killed and wounded hundreds of people around the world. Now, if you were born in the 1920s, you'd likely be old enough to remember the September 11th attacks, which were a turning point in the war on terror. After 9/11s, The United States went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, which further destabilized the Middle East and made the world an even more dangerous place. You'd also have to deal with the threat of nuclear terrorism. As the world became more interconnected, it became easier for terrorist groups to acquire weapons of mass destruction. This led to a real fear that a terrorist group could get their hands on a nuclear bomb and cause massive devastation. Even if you survived all the wars and conflicts, being born in the 1920s wouldn't have been great because the world was becoming an increasingly dangerous place due to global terrorism. It was a powder keg ready to explode into two of the deadliest conflicts in history. And some of the worst atrocities included the Holocaust, the rape of Nanjing, the firebombing of Dresden, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so much more. Not exactly what we call the best timeline to be alive. And that means if you were born in the 1920s, you'd probably get killed in World War II, especially if you lived anywhere in Europe. World War II was a global war that involved every continent and most countries in the world. But it was particularly brutal in Europe, where much of the fighting took place. If you lived there, your home would be destroyed, your friends and family might be murdered, and there's a decent chance that you will be drafted into the army or forced into labor, regardless of whether you wanted to fight or not. So if you were born in the 1920s in Europe, chances are your life would be pretty short and painful. Being born in the 1920s still wouldn't have been great, because right after that came the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. It lasted from the end of World War II until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now the Cold War never got hot, so no large-scale war ever broke out between these superpowers. But it did cause a lot of problems like proxy wars, terrorism, and nuclear proliferation. The Cold War was also marked by an arms race in which both sides amassed huge arsenals of nuclear weapons, which meant that at any moment humanity could have ended in a nuclear apocalypse. Also, the Cold War led to a lot of division, not only in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. People were often forced to choose sides, and this caused a lot of tension and conflict. In many ways, the Cold War was just as bad as the actual hot wars that had taken place before it. It was a time when the world was on edge, and people lived in fear of nuclear war. So if you were born in the 1920s and lived through World War II, you still wouldn't have been safe, because you'd have to survive the Cold War as well. The 1920s saw the end of World War I, which devastated much of Europe. World War II was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, taking an estimated 70 to 85 million lives. But let's say you avoided all that and lived through World War II. But even if you managed to survive all that, being born in the 1920s wouldn't have been great, because right after the Cold War came the rise of global terrorism. On top of all that, people born in the 1920s would have witnessed the worst of the environmental movement. Being born in the 1920s would have been terrible for another reason as well. Now let's talk about one of the worst things about being born in the 1920s. So yeah, being born in the 1920s would have been terrible.